In order to give you some context for what I'm going to talk about today, I want to start with talking about how coffee has historically been sourced, going back a couple of hundred years. Now, in the early days of a coffee industry, coffee was a commodity pure and simple. Where it came from didn't really matter. It wasn't a kind of part of how coffee tasted. There were brands and people might have preferred the taste of a brand's coffee, but there was no idea that a coffee from a different place might have tasted any different, certainly amongst the consuming public. This began to change, really, from the 1950s onwards, and certain producing countries got pretty good at marketing their own product, and you began to see things like mountain-grown coffee or those kind of phrases or brands like Juan Valdez begin to differentiate coffee somewhat. There was the idea that coffee could taste better or potentially worse based on where it came from. Now, this transition is what we would call going from the first wave of coffee, where it was very much commoditized, into a second wave of coffee where there was some differentiation happening within the marketplace. Now, this really transitioned again with the arrival of what's called the third wave of coffee. And at this point, a bunch of people began to feel that really we were missing out by not exploring the taste of place of coffee. The idea that different coffees from different farms that might even neighbor each other, well, they would taste different. Now, this was hugely challenging as a new movement because there was 200 years of the way the coffee industry worked that wasn't really interested in traceable, transparent kind of sourcing. They weren't really interested in differentiation in a way. Traceability presents a number of challenges, and with it, it also adds a number of costs. Traceable coffee costs more money. Now, the upside as a consumer would be that if you're buying traceable coffee, chances are, not guaranteed, but chances are it will taste better, because there's no point spending the additional money keeping a lot of coffee separate from all the other coffee if it's not worth more when it finally reaches the market. So these days, that's the simplest, easiest hack in the coffee world. If you want to buy something good, buy it as traceably as you can. You might then think you could only buy coffee from a single farm, but that isn't the way the world works. You can't just say buy from a single farm, because there are many different ways that coffee is initially produced. There are farms, there are cooperatives, there are groups that have tiny plots of land that feed into one single processing mill. There's no one simple answer. And that means you have to have some trust from the person that you're buying it from, or learn a little bit about the coffee industry itself to understand why you can buy a single estate from Costa Rica, but why that's very hard to do from somewhere like Ethiopia. Where coffee comes from has a dramatic impact on its taste. Not just the soil or the climate, but there are also things like cultural practices around harvesting and post-processing that give it uniqueness, that give coffee diversity, that make it so much fun to drink and explore and to learn about. And so now I'm going to hand over to Will from pactcoffee.com, who is going to take you deeper into the supply chain and show you a little bit more about all of the hands that touch coffee on the way from the farm to the cup.
Hi, I'm Will from PactCoffee.com. Today I'm going to be talking to you about where coffee comes from. I won't be talking to you about Chaldi or the movement of coffee beans from Ethiopia to Yemen and beyond. I'm going to be talking to you about the supply chain. As far as consumers are concerned, coffee comes from a coffee shop or a supermarket. If you're a roaster, and you actually think about it, it comes from a warehouse or an importer. From an importer, it comes from an exporter via a shipper, and from an exporter, it could be coming from a mill and a cooperative. It's a very long way before we get back to that farmer we all think about. If you aren't familiar with the traditional coffee supply chain, it's a very complicated place to work. There are lots of parties offering lots of very different services which are absolutely necessary to move coffee from origin to your roastery. But what becomes obvious when you look more deeply is that the value of those services doesn't necessarily add up to the amount of margin that's taken along the supply chain. So how can you make sure that the money is moving through the supply chain as you expect, getting back to the farmer of the coffee that you love to serve? An important question to ask is always, is the coffee you're buying being bought at a differential from the commodity market, which would link the price to a model which currently puts most coffee's pricing below the cost of production, or is it being bought at an outright price based on the quality of the coffee that the farmer has produced? Importers can add a huge amount of value to your business, but all of those services should be considered separate to the cost of your green coffee. You need to make sure that the money is moving through that company, getting all the way back to those farmers you want to work with. At Pact, we've spent the last 8 years making both ourselves and the farmers we work with more integrated, through the supply chain. We do this to make sure that we can control as many of the costs. So as farmers increase the quality of their coffee, and we begin to pay more money for that coffee, the increased payments don't get soaked up as margin through that supply chain, and the farmers actually get the uplift in profit that they're expecting. That's not to say we don't need to use shippers and insurance companies and warehouses, logistics throughout the entire supply chain. What it does mean is we have 100% control over what those costs are. We're able to put them out to tender and ensure that every dollar we spend on buying specialty coffee goes exactly where we expect it to, and the farmer gets the best deal. In the case of Walter Callex in Honduras, who I've been working with since 2016, it was pretty obvious that with the addition of a depulper, he would drastically be able to increase his profitability. So using the Pact 3-phase program, we were able to offer him microfinance at no extra cost to him or us, give him the ability to have his own depulper and washing station. That drastically increased his profitability, and he shared that tool and his education with his local community. So now the 12 families that surround him are all able to produce significantly higher quality coffee, but also they're able to earn more money from it. Doing this means building relationships with people all the way along the supply chain, hence the name Relationship Coffee. This doesn't just mean shaking hands with coffee farmers and taking photos. It means recognizing the hard work of everybody through the supply chain, but also making sure that the money gets back to the people who put the hard work in. Every coffee you buy will likely have its own unique supply chain, and you might not be able to influence that supply chain the same way we can at Pact. But by beginning to understand the supply chain itself, by working with the right partners in a very transparent way, you should be able to begin having more of an impact on the price that gets back to those farmers whose coffee you love and sell and drink.